This video is sponsored by Ironweld, a wargaming event with a series of tournaments held on May 27th and 28th. There's going to be a huge 40k major, so please go check it out. More about them later in the video. You can find them on wickeddicey.com/ironweld. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and let's talk terrain. Now, terrain is vitally important in games of Warhammer 40,000. I think so much so that it can define entire metagames and determine the outcome of a game or a specific matchup. So one thing that's weird about 40k is that the terrain rules in the rulebook itself are more like guidelines. They tell you how to operate terrain that already exists, but Warhammer 40k doesn't have any hard and fast rules for setting up terrain before a game starts, which is why the competitive community in a lot of cases has put it upon themselves to come up with some terrain formats. Now, a lot of these formats are used in different areas of the world, but sometimes there's a little bit of crossover. But if you're unfamiliar with the terrain format and you go into an event that's using it and you don't know exactly how it works, it can be a little bit of a culture shock. So what we're going to be doing today is going through the major terrain formats that are used in the competitive 40k community, the special rules that they use, and some of the advantages and disadvantages, as well as types of terrain that you should expect to see on tables of that format. I do want to apologize quickly ahead of time. There is some renovation going on in my building right now, which is one of the reasons that you see all this garbage, and you may hear some banging and construction noises in the background. And if you do, I apologize, but hopefully it's not too bad. And as always, if you enjoy my style of 40k content and this video, please click like on it, maybe subscribe to the channel, all the YouTube things, and let's dive into some terrain talk. But first, a little bit of Ironweld. Let me get my crystal ball and call me a psychic, because I'm about to make a bold prediction here. Which is that if you're watching this video about Warhammer tournaments, you probably enjoy miniature gaming tournaments yourself. And if you're looking for one to go to in the next couple months, oh boy, have I got news for you. Because this video is sponsored by Ironweld, a new event run by the folks over at Wicked Dicey. Ironweld is going to be a cross-denominational miniature gaming extravaganza run on the weekend of May 27th and 28th. It'll have events and seminars for games of all types, including Star Wars Legion, MCP, Conquest, Battletech, Malifaux, and many more. But of course, the headliners are GT level events for both Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar. The Wicked Dicey crew put on Everwinter this past December, an event for which I streamed most of the 40k GT, so I can say with experience that the crew puts on some incredible shows, and Ironweld promises to be even bigger and better. This convention is even being held near my neck of the woods in Wakefield, Massachusetts. There's awesome access, good parking for folks who are driving in, and a lot of awesome local activities. So clear out the weekend of May 27th and 28th and check out wickeddicey.com/ironweld to get your ticket today. The first terrain we're going to cover is the UKTC, or the UK Tournament Circuit format. This is terrain composed of a series of mapped layouts, one for each mission in the GT packet, and they all use a uniform set of terrain that's available to most UK-based tournament organizers. Most of the large events, the majors and super majors being held in England, use the UKTC format. So what we're going to do today in some of the situations where we can get good models of the terrain on TTS is run through some of the layouts. Now, this is a good example of the type of terrain you can expect from UKTC. A lot of the terrain itself is pretty self-explanatory. It's represented by L-shaped ruins and buildings that protect units that are hiding behind them from two angles of line of sight. Now, light cover itself can be a little bit difficult to source in this format since a lot of the Ls are very narrow. And in order to gain cover from them, you'll have to touch them and be seen through these windows since you'll no longer be affected by the obscuring keyword. Now, the ruins themselves are pretty small, and while they do block line of sight adequately to little units, usually 5 to 8 models or so, larger units can have a little bit of trouble hiding behind these particular features. However, that can be made up for a little bit with these small, low ruined walls of dense cover that are also typically scattered around these maps, usually in the center. These also have the defense line keyword, so one thing that you'll have to do is learn the defense line rules before playing on UKTC. Basically, it extends your engagement range by an inch when you're fighting over it. Now, while the relatively small size of a lot of the terrain features can make alpha strikes in UKTC fairly powerful, they are adequate enough to block line of sight within your own deployment zone pretty well, but when your opponent has pre-game moves or forward deploys and things like that, a lot of times they can very easily move around the line of sight blocking terrain to hit you regardless. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that several of the ruins in the UKTC format, especially these small rectangular ones in the side, actually have the obscuring keyword, but it doesn't do anything. They aren't 5 inches tall, and while most terrain formats have house rules that get around that restriction, since the obscuring keyword is required to be 5 inches tall in order to have an effect, most events will say that it has effect regardless because, frankly, that rule's a little unnecessary, but UKTC does not. So despite the fact that these say that they're obscuring, they don't actually block line of sight that way. They have to block line of sight naturally, which means you can usually only fit maybe 4 models hiding behind this small ruin here before your opponent gets an easy way to peek around the line of sight. UKTC does have a separate layout for each mission and deployment style, so if you're playing in a UKTC event, make sure you go through those and familiarize yourself with the placement of ruins versus dense cover for each mission, because it can change your strategy quite a bit. A lot of times you'll find dense cover in place of a line of sight blocking ruin on a side objective or something, so you'll be able to defend that area pretty well, but you won't be able to do so from out of line of sight. Now let's move across the pond from the UK series to the US Open series and talk about the USO terrain format. Now this is the only format that's quote-unquote officially endorsed by Games Workshop, since it is used in their US Open tournament series, which is run by Games Workshop proper. So it's used on a lot of the events in the United States, and that has bled out into smaller independent events. So more often than not, if you're playing in a GT or major level event that doesn't have its own terrain system in the US, you will most likely be using US format terrain. This format and similar layouts are also used in their official matched play events in Warhammer World in Nottingham. Those are the official events run by Games Workshop in their own play space. If you've ever seen an event that's really awkwardly titled as a matched play event, that's most likely being played at Warhammer World. Now, we used US Open maps for the T5S2 series that run over on my Discord and also on a lot of online 40k events in the previous season. Since then, we've moved on to a more WTC style of format, but this is a map from the last season. And one thing that you'll notice immediately about the US Open layout is that it very much prizes function over form, since all of the area terrain in the format is provided by these enormous blocks of ruined terrain. These can be easily flat packed at events. A lot of times you'll find events will store their bases separately from the terrain on top. All of the terrain has these 3-walled vertical elements on top, but more often than not, TOs will provide sometimes clear acrylic, sometimes a textured base, sometimes even laser cut neoprene to take the place of these 12 by 12 bricks of terrain. The smaller ruins on top provide vertical elements and true line of sight blocking, but the obscuring keyword, it's important to remember, is taken from the base itself, which means that units standing on either side of this open area will still have their line of sight blocked just because of the mechanics of the feature. As of the recording of this video, only 3 layouts exist for the US Open format that are split between the different deployment types, but each one's composed pretty uniformly. Each one has 4 large 12 by 12 obscuring ruin features, 2 small 5-inch by 10-inch rectangular obscuring ruins, and 4 smaller forest terrain features with an occasional light cover terrain feature, specifically in layout 3. Although I think the intention with that is that it's actually composed of the bases of some of the forest terrain, since that layout doesn't use as much forest terrain. Now, the uniformity means that you can create all the different layouts from the same pool of terrain, which means you don't need to provide any additional terrain to supply a tournament with US Open format boards. That said, the amount of terrain on the table, and especially the amount of light cover and obscuring, is often criticized in this format just for the sheer defensiveness of it. Obviously, all of these obscuring terrain features will block line of sight to models standing behind it, regardless of the vertical terrain features on them, as long as you can benefit from the obscuring keyword. But then oftentimes in the quote-unquote official version, there are also these 3-walled ruins on top of that. So even units inside the terrain will be both benefiting from light cover and be out of true line of sight to enemies that are standing on the other side of that wall. That makes it extremely easy to threaten the center of the table in US Open formats, but sometimes there is a little bit of a long way to get across the midline between these 2 ruins, and if you're trying to play too aggressively, your opponent can punish you pretty heavily. Now, these smaller terrain features don't typically have true line of sight blocking terrain on top of them. they mostly benefit from the obscuring keyword and grant light cover. But one thing, a little bit of an idiosyncrasy of the format, is that its ease of access, which is certainly by design, does mean that oftentimes you'll find that there are some wild divergences in the actual 3D elements that are placed on top of these buildings. A lot of times stores will source the bases, but then use whatever existing terrain they had previously to place on top of that base. So you'll find terrain ends up, looking like a bunch of different stuff. It could be perforated with a lot of holes, could, not be line of sight blocking at all, or it could be very difficult to move around if it's a big solid building or something like that. So one thing to keep in mind if you are playing in a US Open format event is to get a picture beforehand of what the terrain on top of the base is going to look like, because it's not just the obscuring keyword that you have to worry about in these situations. Oftentimes TOs as well will apply house rules on top of this terrain system in order to sort of shore up the weaknesses of using their own terrain. The official terrain has a floor on the first floor, so usually it's about 4 inches tall with a floor, which means that units inside that are incredibly difficult to see even from above. So TOs will oftentimes call these terrain features either being infinitely tall, so they block true line of sight to anything behind them, regardless of its height, or you treat some of the gaps as closed for these buildings. Now, I'm kind of biased towards the US Open terrain format, largely because it's the most commonly one played in my area, so I have a lot of in-person play experience on this style of terrain, but it can feel kind of samey after repeat plays, since the layouts are all fairly similar, and it can oftentimes punish gun lines that are relying on kind of a ranged alpha strike, since it's incredibly easy to hide your entire army in this format. There are very few armies in the game, outside ones running Titanic units or units that can't be hid by the obscuring keyword, that cannot hide their entire army on the first turn. And anyone who benefits from cover will have a great time on these terrain features, because light cover is available basically anywhere on the board. There are like 5 square feet of light cover, which is a lot. But that said, it does give an incredibly consistent experience, and it's easy to provide for and set up for an event using it. Especially given that it's a format that's backed by the game's designers. It's kind of the only quote-unquote official terrain format 40k has, at least for GT missions, and I think that it serves that purpose pretty well. Now, speaking of which, the 40k major at the Ironweld event is going to be using the US Open format, and will have solid line of sight blocking walls on top of that central 12 by 12 inch terrain. So, can expect a consistent terrain experience from your games over there at Ironweld, and I hope to see you there. I don't know if I mentioned already, but I'm streaming it also, so it's gonna be live that weekend. You should come hang out with me on this YouTube channel while we talk about it. And with that, we'll move on. We'll go back across the pond, but this time not to UK. We're going to be going to Europe to talk about the WTC format. WTC stands for the World Team Championship, an annual competition run in Europe in which teams from multiple countries compete for national glory and aplomb. The WTC is a huge deal for European Warhammer 40k events, with spots on the national team often being presented as prizes for high-ranking players in their larger majors. And those events are typically used as practice for the WTC teams to get competitive games in throughout the season on the lead up to the WTC proper. Now, the WTC format itself is designed specifically for use in a team format, and the ways that they've done that we'll talk about a little bit later. But despite that, it's important to note that a lot of singles events will also use the WTC format. And in my opinion, it's probably the most heavily designed terrain format, so I think it's a worthwhile one to take a look at. Certainly, it's the most complex and in-depth, and that's largely because of the team format for which it is designed. So how exactly is it designed for that team environment? There are several layouts of table in the WTC format that share a similar number of terrain features. Just like US Open uses the same features for all 3 of its layouts, each table in WTC uses the same features, but then changes them depending on the deployment type. This means that you have multiple possible setups for each mission, because you could be playing on a different table that has a different pool of terrain. This is meant to give a variety of terrain styles, either light, medium, or heavy. That makes table selection during the team pairing process a lot more interesting, since gunline armies are going to try to prioritize light tables where they can reign supreme with their long-range guns, whereas melee armies or infantry-based armies are going to be focusing on the heavy terrain that have a ton of ruined buildings in them for them to maneuver through. That said, if WTC is being played in a 1 versus 1 event, it will focus on the medium-level tables that offer a lot more balanced matchups. Now, individually, WTC tables are pretty masterfully designed, with small but overlapping pockets of obscuring terrain that block line of sight across the center of the table. This makes it difficult to shoot across the entirety of the board. But a fast army can sometimes move around the edges of such terrain to get line of sight into it. Oftentimes, and depending on the table and layout in question, the size and proximity of WTC terrain can make it either difficult or impossible to deploy or move larger models like super heavies and big tanks and things. WTC tables in general tend to be extremely toxic to large and super heavy models. It's basically impossible to maneuver a Bane Blade on most of these maps, for example. Now, in terms of the terrain features themselves, almost all WTC terrain is made up of these L-shaped ruins, both a variety with windows in it that can be seen through once touched, or a version without. There will also be obstacle terrain that is house ruled to be line of sight blocking without these gaps in it, as well as forest terrain and the occasional industrial vent that is not a standard GW style of terrain, but it provides light and dense cover without reducing the movement of units moving through. You'll find some terrains have a lot of light cover on them because of these industrial vent placements, and sometimes there's a lot of forests, which can provide dense cover but will slow you down. Now, one last thing to keep in mind about the format is the weight of house rules in the WTC, both the terrain format and the format at large. They absolutely love their house rules over there. Just take a perusal of the WTC terrain rules document before playing in an event using them, especially keeping in mind that some of the terrain, especially the trees on the forest bases, do not actually impede movement, and some smaller ruins with the obscuring keyword may not be able to be ignored even by touching it at some angles. It's a little bit convoluted, but after a couple playthroughs, you'll probably get it. Now, moving on back to the US, let's talk about the FLG format. Now, this is a format that uses player-placed terrain. It's often abbreviated to PPT, and sometimes they call it player-optimized terrain because player-placed terrain, I don't know, occasionally has a bad stigma. Player-optimized terrain abbreviates to POT, which is pretty funny. Now, terrain for each table in these events is distributed based on the Frontline Gaming terrain kits. This is the Frontline Gaming system, and they run a lot of large majors like Atlantic City Open, the Las Vegas Open. So generally speaking, this is a bespoke tournament format just for them. But some smaller events have adopted the system and adapted it for use in their own environment. So all of the terrain sets for each table are actually determined by the terrain that either Frontline Gaming sells specifically with their laser cut MDF systems, or terrain that they have built up from past events. So you'll find that there's a lot of legacy table setups. So you'll get to a table, you'll have a pool of terrain on it. That terrain is then evenly distributed between the two players, and the players take turns placing those terrain features within their own territory. This adds a new layer of strategy to the game before the deployment of armies. You can affect the terrain on your side of the table as determined by the mission deployment, but terrain cannot be placed within 4 inches of other terrain features, and some larger terrain features cannot be placed within 6 inches of other terrain. This gives an extra incentive for a player to be the defender, and this is especially in instances where there is a centrally located objective. Since placing the first piece of terrain can go right up to the edge of your territory, so the midline of the table, depending on your deployment zone, if your opponent hasn't placed any terrain there, there's no other restrictions on placing it. So oftentimes you can put a piece of terrain right up against their territory edge, and you can restrict their terrain placement around the middle of the table, or give yourself cover on the front of the central objective. This is one of the biggest criticisms of the FLG terrain placement format, because it can give a huge benefit to the player who is deploying first. From there, though, you'll get almost complete control over where terrain goes on your own side of the table. There are some other player-placed terrain formats that are lesser used that allow players to place terrain anywhere on the table, not just restricted to their deployment zone, which means that there is a sort of counterplay to terrain placement, where you can try to block terrain placement in areas where your opponent would try to set up line of sight blocking terrain, and the Frontline Gaming system doesn't do that. So you'll be able to get good line of sight blocking terrain both where you're starting and in staging areas where you can move up the table, hidden behind obscuring terrain, and keep at least some of your army relatively safe. Now, since there are so many board types in this format, it's difficult to talk about the individual terrain features being used, but generally it favors favors square ruins with little in the way of line of sight blocking inside them, so you have to rely very heavily on their obscuring keyword to protect models hiding behind them. This means that they can often be easily defeated by flanking maneuvers that you'll then have to set up other terrain features to try to block. We can move on and talk about an alternative to the frontline gaming player-placed system, and that is Canadian player-placed terrain.
Now, I don't know if that's the official name. I kind of just made that up, but I know that a couple large events in Canada use this system, and I think it's worth talking about. So that's what I have to say about that.
Now, the frontline gaming format is all over the place because frontline gaming themselves have so many different tables full of terrain, all of which are accounted for in their system. The Canadian player-placed terrain system has a similar rule set, but focuses much more on having a consistent terrain layout. The mechanics themselves are very similar to frontline gaming player-placed terrain. Players take turns placing terrain in their territory, starting with the defender. Terrain cannot be within 4 inches of each other. Large pieces cannot be within 6. But a big change is that some smaller area terrain that doesn't have vertical movement blocking elements are just restricted to 1 inch away from other terrain features. So you can actually give yourself a little bit of dense cover from forest, for example, as you're moving out of your ruins. Now, the biggest change between these two systems is the central objective problem, where frontline gaming has the defender able to place a line of sight blocking terrain potentially on the center objective or within range to control it at least. The Canadian system has solved this by predetermining terrain around the center objective. So any missions that do have that central objective dictate the placement of a couple ruins, meaning that they're also going to restrict the placement of other nearby terrain features and just give a much more consistent and fair experience. Otherwise, the format focuses specifically on large L-shaped ruin pieces to block lines of sight from 2 angles. These can provide a lot of defense for models that benefit from the obscuring keyword, but many of those pieces feature large doors or windows, which can be seen through if you are Titanic. That said, a lot of these doors and windows are large enough for units like vehicles, monsters, and cavalry to actually move through. In my second channel, I actually made a video about some of the terrain features that are like this and how it can be really transformative to how Warhammer 40k plays.
Holy Jesus. What is that?
That helps the mobility of units like monsters and vehicles immensely that are usually stuck behind ruin walls and makes them a lot more competitive in this format. And it has a lot of the same benefits that the other player-placed terrain systems do, where you're going to be able to set up line of sight blocking terrain in your deployment zone or stage it as you're moving to the middle of the table and keep yourself relatively safe on your way in. But some of this terrain can be defeated by a deft maneuvering. And with that, that is all the terrain systems that I wanted to cover today. These are, at least to my knowledge, the systems that are used most often around the world. And you'll find that a lot of smaller events are kind of incentivized by the larger events adopting these terrain systems to also use them. So you'll find smaller events that are in the orbit of these larger super majors that define the terrain system as also taking those over. Now let me know down in the comment section if you feel there's any points about these terrain systems that I missed. I don't play very commonly on a lot of them. While we are using WTC in the most recent T5S2 series, and like I mentioned before, I play US Open almost all the time, the other terrain formats I'm less familiar with. If there are any other terrain formats that you use in your local community and you feel warrant a discussion, go ahead and drop them down in the comment section. And as always, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Huge thanks to Ironweld as well for sponsoring the video. I hope you go check them out. The terrain at the Wicked Dicey events is always great. We have like sort of a consistent pool of terrain in the New England area that a lot of TOs use. And so it's good consistency. It's very nice. Hope to see you that weekend. And thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks. And have happy wargaming.